10 years ago, I sat across from my father in his study a business plan in a blue folder trembling slightly in my hands and asked him for $4,000 to get my company off the ground. He looked at the folder without opening it and said, "Sienna, I didn't spend 30 years building a real business to watch you play startup with my retirement money. Get a real job. This isn't for you." 2 weeks ago, a resume landed on my desk for a VP of Operations position at my company. The name at the top was Douglas Marlowe. If this story is already hitting you somewhere, personal, hit subscribe and drop where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single comment. My name is Sienna Marlowe. I'm 34 years old. This is what happened when the man who refused to invest a single dollar in my future ended up needing a job from the company he told me would never work. Let me take you back to that study because what landed on my desk 2 weeks ago didn't come from nowhere. It came from 10 years of building something entirely alone, brick by brick, after being told in the clearest possible terms that I wasn't worth the risk. My father, Douglas Marlowe, built a regional trucking and logistics company from a single truck in the early 90s into a business with 40 vehicles and a warehouse outside Charlotte by the time I graduated college. He'd started the company at 26, driving the single truck himself for the first 3 years, sleeping in rest stops to save money, building relationships with shippers, one handshake at a time until the business finally had enough steady contracts to hire a second driver. He was proud of that, understandably, and measured most things in his life against the specific visible grind it had taken him to build it. He also measured me against it constantly, in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. Every choice I made evaluated against whether it looked like the kind of sacrifice he'd made, whether it looked real enough to earn his respect. Growing up, dinner table conversations often circled back to some version of the same theme: the value of hands-on work, the suspicion of anything that looked too easy or too modern, a specific skepticism toward people who'd never actually built anything that I absorbed as a child without fully understanding. It would eventually be aimed directly at me. He wasn't unkind exactly, not in any way that would have looked obviously wrong from the outside. He simply had one narrow definition of what counted as legitimate effort, and I spent most of my childhood and 20s trying without quite realizing it to fit inside that definition. I studied supply chain management in college partly because it genuinely interested me, and partly I think now because some part of me hoped it might finally speak his language, give us common ground he'd respect instead of dismiss. After graduating, I worked for 4 years at a mid-sized logistics software company, learning the industry from the technology side, while my father's company still ran largely on paper manifests and a fax machine he refused to replace, insisting whenever I gently suggested otherwise that the old systems work fine if you actually know what you're doing. By 24, I'd developed a concept for a routing optimization platform specifically built for regional trucking companies like his own smaller operations that couldn't afford the enterprise software the big players used, but desperately needed the efficiency gains it offered. I spent 8 months building the initial prototype on nights and weekends, teaching myself enough coding to build a functional demo running the numbers obsessively until I was confident the concept could genuinely save companies like my father's real meaningful money on fuel and labor costs, staying up until 2 in the morning, some nights fueled by cheap coffee and the specific stubbornness that comes from wanting to prove something to someone who probably wasn't going to notice the effort either way. I put together a business plan. Thorough, carefully researched projections built from actual industry data instead of optimistic guesswork, and asked for a meeting with my father, hoping more than I probably should have that he'd see the idea for what it was, rather than filtering it entirely through what he'd already decided about me. I remember driving to his house that Sunday afternoon, the blue folder on the passenger seat, rehearsing the pitch in my head the entire way, adjusting the wording, anticipating questions, trying to sound confident, instead of as nervous as I actually felt. His study smelled like it always did: leather and old cigar smoke from years earlier, a room I'd rarely been invited into as a kid, except when I was in trouble for something. The same worn leather chair he'd sat in for as long as I could remember, family photos arranged carefully on the bookshelf behind him, most of them featuring the trucks and the warehouse, rather than any of us. I laid out the concept carefully. The routing software, the target market of small and mid-sized regional carriers, exactly like his own company. The projected savings, the $4,000 I needed for the initial development team, and a beta launch with 2 friendly early customers I'd already lined up, informally contacts I'd made through my current job who'd expressed genuine interest in piloting the concept. I watched his face the entire time, hoping for something curiosity, even skepticism I could answer with data, some flicker of the engagement I'd have gotten from any other business owner I'd pitched this concept to informally over the previous months. He didn't open the folder. He set it down on the desk between us, still closed, and said flatly, "Sienna, I didn't spend 30 years building a real business to watch you play startup with my retirement money." He gestured vaguely at the folder like it was something distasteful he didn't want touching his desk any longer than necessary. "Get a real job. This isn't for you." I tried to explain further, mentioned the 2 early customers, the actual industry data behind the projections, the fact that I wasn't asking for the money as a gift, but as an investment with real calculated upside. He cut me off. "You've never run a business a day in your life. I have. I know what it actually takes, and I know you don't have it. I'm not throwing away money I worked 30 years for on a hobby." A hobby. I sat there for a long moment, the blue folder still closed on the desk between us, understanding with a clarity that felt almost physical that he'd already decided the outcome of this meeting before I'd said a single word. I left that afternoon without the money, without his blessing, and without, I realized somewhere on the drive home, much interest in ever asking him for anything. Again, the blue folder still closed, still sitting on his desk where he'd left it. An image that stayed with me for years afterward, more vividly than almost anything else from that day. I didn't tell my mother what had happened for weeks, mostly out of a stubborn, wounded pride that made the whole conversation feel too raw to repeat out loud, though she eventually pieced it together on her own, gently, never quite forcing me to say the words directly. I funded the first year myself instead, maxing out 2 credit cards, taking on freelance consulting work on nights and weekends, alongside my full-time job, living in a studio apartment far smaller than I could have otherwise afforded. All of it channeled into building the platform I'd pitched my father 18 months earlier. I brought on a technical co-founder, a sharp, quiet engineer named Marcus Reyes. I'd met through a mutual contact who agreed to work for reduced pay and equity while we built the first real version of the product together, working out of my cramped apartment most nights since we couldn't yet afford office space takeout containers piling up on the coffee table between coding sessions that regularly ran past midnight. We landed our first paying customer 11 months in a small regional carrier outside Raleigh, with 12 trucks willing to pilot the software in exchange for a steep discount. Their owner, a gruff, practical man named Sal Fontana, who reminded me uncomfortably of my own father in certain moods, though Sal's skepticism, unlike my father's, came with genuine curiosity underneath it. It worked genuinely measurably, an 18% reduction in fuel costs within the first quarter, driven by more efficient routing than their previous manual system had ever managed. That first customer became our best reference, and word spread slowly through the tight-knit world of regional trucking operators, the way word tends to spread in industries built on genuine relationships rather than marketing budgets. By year 3, we'd raised a modest seed round from actual investors. Not my father, never my father, but a small regional venture fund that specialized in logistics technology and saw the same opportunity I'd tried to explain in that study years earlier, sitting across from a partner named Elaine Farrow, who asked within the first 10 minutes of our first meeting exactly the kind of sharp, curious questions I'd once hoped for from my own father and never received. We rebranded the company that year, moving from the working name I'd originally pitched to something cleaner, more professional. Solstice Logistics, a name chosen deliberately partly because it sounded right, and partly, if I'm honest, because it carried no trace of my own name. No immediate, obvious connection back to the family that had already decided the concept wasn't worth their belief. By year 6, Solstice had grown to serve over 200 regional carriers across the Southeast, a team of 31 employees and revenue that had finally definitively stopped feeling fragile, the kind of steady compounding growth that let me sleep through the night for the first time in years without running worst-case scenarios in my head. I became CEO formally that year, having run the company in practice for most of its existence, but finally taking the title that matched the actual work, a small private milestone I celebrated quietly with Marcus and Elaine over dinner. No fanfare, no announcement to the wider family. My father and I saw each other occasionally at family gatherings during those years. Our relationship polite but distant, neither of us bringing up that afternoon in his study an unspoken agreement to simply not revisit it. Conversations at holidays, staying carefully surface-level weather and traffic, and the occasional question about my job that never quite dug deeper. I heard through my mother in fragments over the years that his own trucking company had struggled increasingly against larger, more technologically modern competitors, carriers running exactly the kind of software I'd once tried to sell him on building into his own operation. He never adopted anything comparable himself too proud. My mother suggested gently to admit that the industry had changed faster than his own methods had, clinging instead to the same manual systems that had served him well for 20 years, but simply couldn't compete anymore against faster, cheaper, more efficient operations. 2 years ago, my mother told me quietly over coffee that my father's company had finally been sold to a larger regional carrier. The sale itself, modest. Most of the proceeds absorbed by debts he'd taken on, trying too late to modernize a fleet that had fallen badly behind. He was 61, technically retired, though the retirement my mother admitted hadn't come with nearly the financial cushion he'd always assumed it would, the sale price falling well short of what he'd spent decades expecting his life's work to be worth. She told me he'd taken it hard, spending the first few months afterward unmoored in a way she'd never seen from him before. A man whose entire identity had been built around the trucks in the warehouse suddenly without either. Have you ever watched a parent's certainty about their own methods quietly collide with an industry that simply moved on without them? Sit with that for a second, because I sat with it for 2 years, hearing occasional updates through my mother, never quite sure what, if anything, I owed a man who'd once told me without hesitation that I didn't have what it took. 2 weeks ago, I was reviewing candidate applications for an open VP of Operations position at Solstice, a senior role overseeing our carrier partnerships and logistics strategy across our expanding footprint. Our head of HR, a sharp, thorough woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, had flagged a handful of strong candidates for my final review before interviews began. I scrolled through the stack mostly on autopilot until one name stopped me entirely. Douglas Marlowe. 31 years of experience in regional trucking and logistics operations, most recently as owner-operator of Marlowe Freight, until it sailed 2 years earlier. The resume was competent, honestly written, listing real accomplishments from decades in the industry, applying for a role at a company he had no reason to know was mine, since the application had come through a general job board, and Solstice Logistics carried no obvious connection back to a daughter he'd last meaningfully discussed a business idea with in a study a decade earlier. I sat with the resume open on my screen for a long time, feeling something complicated settle over me. Not quite satisfaction, not quite anger, something closer to a strange, vertiginous recognition that the exact life he'd once dismissed as a hobby was now apparently a place he was hoping might hire him. I brought the resume to Priya the next morning, explaining carefully who Douglas Marlowe actually was to me, watching her expression shift from professional neutrality to genuine surprise as the pieces connected. She asked gently how I wanted to proceed, whether I wanted to recuse myself from the process entirely, or handle it directly, or simply pass on the application without ever letting him know the connection at all, laying out each option evenly without pushing me toward any particular choice. I thought about it for 2 full days before deciding, running through the possibilities during my commute, during quiet moments at my desk, turning the decision over from every angle I could think of. I told Priya I wanted to interview him myself formally through the normal process, no favoritism in either direction, giving him the exact same fair evaluation any other qualified candidate would receive. Part of me wanted to know honestly whether he'd actually built the kind of judgment over 31 years that the resume suggested. And part of me, if I'm being fully honest, wanted him to sit across a desk from me in a room he didn't yet understand I controlled. The interview was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. I sat in our small conference room, Priya beside me, for the formal portion, watching through the glass wall, as my father walked into our lobby, older than I remembered him, looking a slight stoop in his shoulders that hadn't been there a decade earlier, dressed carefully in a suit that looked slightly out of style, the kind you keep for exactly these occasions and rarely wear otherwise. A suit I recognized with a strange pang as the same one he'd worn to my college graduation nearly 12 years earlier. He didn't recognize the building, didn't recognize the company name on the glass doors, walked through our lobby, scanning the space with the careful, slightly nervous attentiveness of someone trying to make a good first impression on strangers, glancing at the framed industry awards on the wall, the open plan office visible through the glass behind reception, 38 employees moving through their ordinary Tuesday afternoon, without any idea their CEO's father was about to walk into the building. Priya greeted him at reception, walked him back to the conference room, and opened the door for him to step inside. He saw me before I said anything, and I watched in real time every stage of recognition move across his face, confusion first brow, furrowing like he was trying to make sense of an equation that didn't balance, then disbelief, his mouth opening slightly without any words coming out, then something that looked almost like fear. The specific fear of a man realizing the room he'd walked into wasn't the room he'd prepared for at all. That whatever careful mental script he'd rehearsed on the drive over had just become entirely useless. "Sienna," he said, standing frozen in the doorway. This is your company?" "I founded it 10 years ago," I said, keeping my voice level, gesturing toward the chair across from me. "Please sit. I'd like to conduct this interview the same way I would with any other candidate, if that's all right with you." He sat slowly, visibly shaken, glancing between me and Priya like he was trying to reassemble an entire understanding of the last decade in real time. "I had no idea," he said. "The listing just said Solstice Logistics. I never connected it. I rebranded years ago," I said. "Partly for business reasons, partly, if I'm honest, because I wanted something that didn't carry your name or mine connected to a decision you'd already made about whether I was capable of building it." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the table, unable to quite meet my eyes. "The routing software," he said finally. "This is that idea. The one I told you to forget." "This is that idea," I confirmed. 240 regional carriers use our platform now. We employ 38 people. Last year we did $14.2 million in revenue. It's the hobby you told me to get a real job instead of pursuing. Priya, sitting quietly beside me through most of this, spoke up gently. "Mr. Marlowe, I want to be clear that this interview will proceed on its actual merits. Your experience is genuinely strong on paper, but I think it's fair that the two of you have a moment before we move forward if you need it." My father looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his expression that I hadn't seen from him in years, not quite an apology yet, but the visible beginning of one. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Not just about the loan, about what I thought it took to build something real. I built my company with trucks and fuel contracts and 30 years of stubbornness. You built something that made my entire industry work differently, and I refused to even open the folder. You didn't just refuse the money," I said. "You told me I didn't have it in me. I spent 10 years proving mostly to myself that you were wrong about that specifically." He nodded slowly, absorbing that without argument, which itself told me something had genuinely shifted in him over the years since that study. We finished the interview formally that day, Priya asking her standard questions. My father answering honestly, competently, drawing on 3 decades of real operational knowledge that evaluated fairly actually made him a reasonably strong candidate for a mid-level operations role, if not quite the VP position he'd originally applied for his answers. Steadier as the interview progressed, some of his old practiced confidence gradually returning, once the conversation moved past the initial shock and into territory he actually knew well. I told him plainly after the formal portion concluded that Priya would follow up separately regarding next steps, and that I wanted the decision made entirely on the actual hiring criteria, not on anything happening between the two of us personally. He didn't get the VP role. A more qualified candidate with more directly relevant technology experience was ultimately selected. But Priya offered him a senior operations advisor position, instead part-time consulting on carrier relationships, where his decades of trucking industry relationships genuinely added value. A role sized honestly to his actual current strengths, rather than either inflated out of guilt or dismissed out of old resentment. He's worked with us for 3 months now, quietly, competently, mostly interacting with our carrier partnerships team, rather than with me directly. An arrangement that suits both of us, his decades of relationships across the regional trucking industry, proving genuinely valuable in ways that had nothing to do with our shared history and everything to do with actual expertise honestly applied. We've had 2 dinners since then, careful still finding our footing conversations that occasionally circle back to that afternoon in his study, though neither of us dwells there for long anymore. The topic surfacing and receding naturally, rather than being either avoided entirely or picked apart at length. My mother told me recently that he'd started telling people cautiously proudly that his daughter built one of the fastest-growing logistics platforms in the Southeast, a sentence I never once expected to hear, repeated back to me secondhand, delivered with what my mother described as genuine unguarded pride, rather than the careful, measured approval he'd always rationed out so sparingly when I was younger. It's not the apology I once imagined wanting from him. It's something quieter, an accumulation of small corrections rather than one dramatic reckoning. And I've found to my own surprise that the quieter version is the one that actually feels real. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever built something real after being told you didn't have what it takes, tell me what it felt like when the person who doubted you finally had to reckon with it. I want to know we're not alone in this. My father spent 30 years believing real business only looked like the thing he'd built with his own hands, and it took one closed folder, 1 decade of silence, and 1 job application he never expected to lead back to his own daughter, to finally show him he'd been wrong about what building something real actually requires. I don't tell this story looking for anyone to feel sorry for the version of me who once drove home from that study with an unopened folder on the passenger seat, quietly deciding never to ask for anything from him again. I tell it because I think a lot of people carry some version of that closed door in their own history, a parent, a mentor, someone whose belief they wanted and didn't get, and who built something anyway in the silence that followed. The folder never needed to be opened for the thing inside it to turn out to be real. It just needed someone willing to build it without permission.